All right, welcome back to Design Huddle. We have Mustafa back in studio, and by in
Woohoo.
studio, I mean our makeshift work from home offices. How are you feeling?
Yeah, no, oh my God, I was so sick. It wasn't COVID, but it was COVID-esque. And you do that with children and during a vacation that you've been waiting for ages. Yeah, it was a total cluster. Beep. But I see you've
Nice.
been busy interviewing the world.
Yeah, no, trying to keep the podcast crawling up the rankings. Did you see that I
Yeah.
posted some of the spots that were popular? I said we should move the studio to some of those other countries that appreciate Design Huddle. We were like the number
Yeah, well, I
five
mean,
and number six podcast in other countries, so
well,
we
you
need to
say
get
that. I
away
mean,
from the UK and US audience.
yeah, I mean, you say that. I mean, I think we've spoken about this ages when we first started doing this together, which may be the theme of this podcast, of this episode. There was a dating site in New York that was pitched at the Hasidic Jewish community, and and so it had all like the chaperoning, and it was like designed for that community.
Yeah.
But it didn't really take off. But then they started seeing a huge following in India because they follow in India is very conservative as well, and they follow very similar traditions. And so they rebranded the site and they moved the offices to India, and it became a really successful dating site. So,
Yeah.
so
The-
who knows? Maybe this time next year we could be in like Bangladesh or something. I don't know.
yeah, there's a phenomenal TED Talk that basically went through like all of the for the unicorn startups that basically like rose to fame. Think like Uber, Airbnb, etc. And it kind of went into the dynamics of what makes them like successful. And like the number one most important one was like a team. So like being a team that has like the flexibility to kind of pivot. And the other one was one of the other top five elements was just like straight up timing. Was it just like, is this the right time for the
Yeah,
company or product or service you're building right now? Because if the time it could be the best idea in the world, but if the market's not ready for it or you're late, like it's a missed opportunity. But
yeah,
that's
it's
funny.
true.
We'll have to figure out the name of that company and see how they're doing now. But I'm not
I'm.
surprised that it worked because they had all
It'll
the
probably.
tech in place, right?
Yeah, it'll take me 10 minutes to probably search one, but yeah, the whole podcast you just like, yeah, it's tapping on the keyboard. Um, but yeah, no, another example. I remember one of my uncles was telling me his friend tried to set up a, a travel agency, but all online, like about 5 years before it will happen. And he spent so much money to get a custom built thing. And at that point, I think it must have been late 90s. People just were too reluctant to use their credit cards with a computer. There was still that fear of I don't know what's going to happen and lack of trust. And it
Actually, I had a
obviously
question.
failed.
What do you think changed? Because I think about that a lot, right? We went from like people being terrified to putting their credit cards into the internet, and now it's like people throw it around like no problem. Do you think it's just like the custom? Sometimes I think it's like the comfort of like the customer service of certain like American Express. Like if I have a fraudulent charge, like they reimburse me, they dispute it, and they're really good at kind of like making sure that everything is resolved. But for me, it's always been like generational, where it was like I never had a problem with it. But I remember my
Yeah,
parents for a long time like refused to like
I
put a
think there
credit card
was,
in online.
from my understanding, there was always, well, in the UK anyway, there was always laws that protected the customer from some kind of, especially with credit cards. Debit cards is a bit more problematic because that's basically you're using your own cash, but
Right.
credit cards is someone else's. But I think when credit card companies started ramping up advertising saying that your money is protected, then people felt a bit more comfortable. And I think in the early 2000s in the UK in particular, like that was a big part of like you're protected by, you'd always see that word around. And I think it's a generational thing as well, probably, is people um, like credit cards in the 80s was a sign of, as a status symbol. I remember it's like, what was like Dallas and all those big the American TV shows. So I think once the early 2000s, where credit cards were much more abundant, especially amongst younger people, probably that fear. Um, and also they grew up with the technology, so that was like the way you buy things, rather than some archaic going to a store making this thing come to you. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, but then even with payments, that flow is very unique to certain countries. I think we've spoken about this before, but
Yeah.
like in Brazil and Turkey, where you pay the courier, like the person who delivers the stuff to you rather than online. And there's other things where you pay and then you get the thing to deliver to your house. Like supermarkets do this, like, you know, which is a quite weird thing. You go to a supermarket, you pay, and then you get it to come to deliver to you rather than you just taking your grocery shopping home, because it's like you're carrying your work bag or something, so you're being lazy, or it's just too heavy. So there's so many different payment flows, or SMS. But yeah, no, I find that payment evolution, especially the cultural thing, very interesting.
Yeah, well, this is a perfect bridge to our topic today, which is the cultural differences, and like specifically like how different countries think about design. And you stumbled upon this tweet, which I'll share screens, which is pretty interesting. But why don't you give a read of it, and then I'll share my screen in the background.
So this is, I mean, I think I'll be really interested to speak to get her on the podcast. I think her name is, it's Mika, but her Twitter handle is Paprika. And she was giving like a comparison between essentially Japanese design and or a Japanese YouTuber who was presenting their YouTube channel in English and in Japanese, and the English version, like the thumbnails and the way it's presented, is kind of the stereotype that we have in the West of Japanese design, this serene, you know, peaceful, simplistic, minimalist design. You know, it's very presentable, like which I've always thought, oh, that's Japanese design. But then when she compared it with the Japanese version, like the translation, it's much more visually vibrant, almost chaotic. There's a lot more smiling going on, where in the Japanese it seems to be very solemn or sort of like professional looking. So it just made me think, like, is there a thing with Japanese design where they have an international persona of how they want to project themselves, and then they have a persona for their actual local audiences? And for that was kind of like, so it's not just about translation, it's much more detailed than that. It's like there's a whole thing of how a culture wants themselves to be perceived internationally, which I found really interesting. This is what Marie Kondo's, who's a YouTube channel about organization, I guess. I'm not really familiar with her, but she's quite obviously well known. But I found that weird, of like, you know, and then the Twitter thread goes on, and you see folks pointing out the differences between, say, Japanese design and, say, European or West American design. So you got the gas station example that was posted on Twitter, where you know, the petrol station, gas station, there's just the pump, maybe a payment mechanism there. But then the Japanese one is like 100 different options going on at the same time. Like,
I'm just so curious why so many options for the Japanese one. Like, it seems like a bad experience because like there's so much going on, and like if you're a gas station, you just want people to like swipe their card, get the gas, have it, you know, then put it back on and leave. So there's color codings. Like, I'd love to know why one of the gas handles is green, one's red, one's yellow. And then in terms of what we're looking at, there's literally text everywhere on the entire gas station.
The thing is, with these kind of UI or these kind of experiences, they've been designed with Western characters in mind. And so maybe the Japanese written language is so pictorial that this flow doesn't really pander to like the way the language works. And also, I mean, again, this is another stereotype we have, that Japan is like one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. But maybe the payment mechanisms there, they have different ones. Maybe the banking system isn't as fluid as it is. Like, you know, you can go to almost any ATM, regardless of the bank, and you could use it like in the UK and the US. But maybe that's not the case there. So there's all these other sort of hoops you have to jump through. And then maybe some sort of legacy technology that this stuff is built upon. If you just, this is why having like I think her name's Mika, like having her on a podcast to kind of explain maybe the history of this, and it kind of plays to another stereotype. I remember way back when one of the material designers were telling me that when they were trying to pitch material design to Asia, they found that the Japanese version of material was very simplistic, minimalist, as the stereotype would be. But in China, they preferred a more chaotic UI. I'm wondering now that when they were doing the research, if the participants were just basically giving this international persona to this foreign person who's come to Japan, say, no, this is what Japanese design is, but without actually being honest, saying, no, it's much more chaotic. So it's like, that thing of, if you ask people directly, they won't necessarily tell you the truth. They'll tell you what they think you want to know.
Yeah.
So I mean, and then seeing these like multiple examples of the difference between Japanese design and like day-to-day stuff, I thought, okay, so it's not as simple as, we think simplistic design, like, but with beautiful complexity, like origami or the manga, or like the architecture, like all these kind of stereotypes. It feels like we've either been sold as like a branding exercise from Japan, which is not necessarily accurate representation of day-to-day life, which I thought was really fascinating. I mean, you look at the difference between the coffee machines. I mean, what is going on? Like, you have to go to the YouTube channel to see this, but it's basically like a normal coffee machine with 1,000 labels printed everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's a few things. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. One is just like the visual nature of Japanese text. I don't think it fits these models. It could be like just a lot of additional detail, or they're trying to convert a Western machine to make it fit with Japanese people coming in and out of the coffee shop. The one thing that I found interesting is that this is like at a larger level. The first time I went to Japan, like specifically Tokyo, I found it to be like this like total contrast in like a good way, where you walk through like this amazing calm garden temple, like that's so serene, and it's you can hear it's very organized, it's well manicured. And then a couple blocks down, you're like in the thick of a city that has signs everywhere, neon lights, people, energy. There's just like, so it reminds me of like looking at this coffee machine. It reminds me of like walking through like Shibuya. I think that's how you say it. Like one of the more like, I guess, business touristy districts. And this is like exactly what it was, just like a bunch of stuff like thrown at you all at once. So I would love to get Mika on to kind of like help us sort through this. My other reaction is I think that it's the age old thing with design where it's like too much. If you give a user or a reader too much information, like nothing is actually processed. So I'm curious if somebody walked into the store and they saw, all of this text on this machine, do they still even get the coffee machine? Because coffee is inherently fairly simple. So, so a few things there. One is, have you been to Japan, and do you feel like that metaphor that I mentioned is accurate? And two is like, don't you think that this is almost bad design, or do you think it's just part of the culture and it's completely accepted?
Yeah, I mean, well, to the second point, it'll be difficult to without actually having someone explain some of the historical context to say like their design. It'll be hard to really determine. One thing which I remember, there was a TED talk where it was a guy from China, and he was talking about the differences between language. He was trying to basically show that different languages will have different effects on people's view to money and economics. Like languages which have a lot of future tense type grammar are less likely to do things in the immediate term, and therefore they won't be as successful. Where languages which are all present tense have a tendency to do things in the moment and get things done. But he was talking, when he started the talk, he was speaking about how if you say uncle in Chinese, you would know if the uncle was related to your mother, to your father, was related through marriage, and all these other details. Like in English, it's just auntie and uncle, but in Chinese and also in Turkish, so in many other languages, you have all these different words for something that seems like the same thing. So I'm wondering if in this coffee machine, well, it might be a black coffee. It's not just a black coffee like in Japan. It would be a black coffee with some other kind of beans or whatever. So they need to actually list out what you're actually getting with all these different variations. Almost like, in German, it's like compound languages, so you have really long words. But Yeah, no, I mean, okay, you found an article, The Overwhelming World of Japanese Web Design. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I mean, this is like where you really need someone who's an expert in that field. I think we have a lot of standards in the world of web design which are based on a very Western cultural approach. I remember being in Turkey and speaking with a web design news agency, and they had lots of carousels. And at that point, the world of web carousels was like, this is terrible UX. And when I explained to the news site, like, this is really, really bad UX, they said to me, oh no, we removed them, but then our users complained because this is how they pass the information really quickly. I think I've given this example before. And that kind of took me back thinking, hang on, are we superimposing Western feels to like the standards of design? And what does that mean for design languages or design systems, that we're saying this is like the de facto thing that everyone should be applying? But should they? And so should design systems be customized completely depending on the culture that they're in? And or should these cultures really adopt better user experiences? I mean, that's the thing. It's like, does that make our design systems imperialistic in nature? Do you know what I mean? It brings up all these other things. And again, it's like the Chinese example where they really like lots of UI and lots of buttons because it feels like they're getting their money's worth, as opposed to, do they actually accomplish what they want?
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Design Huddle. The opinions expressed are solely our own and do not express the views or opinions of our employer.